ladies and gentlemen. This is the London Assembly's Housing Committee. I'd like to welcome members of the public and also the committee members, but also those people watching on webcast. Members of the public can can contribute even in terms of perhaps tweeting something with the hashtag of Assembly Housing or hashtag Rough Sleeping LDN. May I now ask if the clerk has been given any apologies from any members?
Chair, we've got no apologies for absence.
Wonderful. On item 2, declarations of interest, can I ask members to note the list of offices on the report and ask if there are any additional interests that need to be declared at this point? Thank you very much. On minutes of the meeting, could I ask members to confirm the minutes of the committee's last meeting on the 24th of January 2017?
Agreed.
Everyone's nodding their head. Item 4, summary list of actions. Can I ask members to note the completed and outstanding list of actions from the previous meetings? There's also the public announcement. Could everybody switch off their phones? Item 5 is Mayor's response to the committee's report, supported housing in the balance. Can I ask members to note the response from the Mayor to the report? Item 6 is I now would like to ask members to agree the committee's report on encouraging biodiversity in new housing developments. And our rapporteur was Leonie Cooper.
Agreed.
Are we agreed on At Home with Nature?
I think I'm agreeing.
Yes, there's a vote over there. Well,
yeah.
There's one anyway. So, yes, I think we all appreciated the work that you put into that, and I think it's going to be a real asset for new developments, I must say.
Thank you, Chair. And also thank you to the scrutiny officers for their considerable support in delivering the report, which obviously was my first rapporteurship as someone freshly elected. Last year, obviously, other members will be familiar with the process, but a lot of support was given, which was I was very grateful for their help.
I was going to make a note. Of course, I was going to make a comment about them being gentle with you because it was your first time, but I won't because that would be misinterpreted. Let's now move on to item 7, which is the main item of today's meeting. Can I ask members to agree the scope and terms of reference for this discussion as outlined in the agenda?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. So, first of all, can I welcome our guests? We have with us today, I'm sorry I didn't manage to get to talk to you beforehand, we have David Eastwood, who's the Services and Commissioning Manager at the GLA. We have Kath Dane, who's the Street Population Coordinator for the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. We have Dan Olney, who is the Assistant Director of Pan London Street Homeless and Outreach Services at St Mungo's. And last but not least, we have Jeremy Swain, who is the Chief Executive of Thames Reach. Now, we'll now launch into the questions, and I'm actually covered with my first one. You're okay to? First question that I have, just to sort of launch this subject, if I can, is why are we seeing an increase in the number of people sleeping rough in the capital? And perhaps Jeremy Swain, perhaps you'd like to answer that.
We've seen an increase in numbers since 2010 in particular, but actually the last 3 quarters of figures, and these are figures we get through our chain database, have shown a fall this year actually, so a fall in all 3 quarters. So we're looking like we're going to see figures by the end of this year. It could be a small reduction. I just note that, but in general, to answer your question, I think that over the last few years, particularly the increase has been around Central and Eastern European rough sleepers on the street. So that's an issue, if you like, around a national issue around migration. And for that group, there's fewer options to help them off the street, so that's a challenge. We've also seen, I think, some issues around people who are falling out of accommodation, particularly around accessing the private renter sector and not managing to maintain that accommodation. We've seen a reduction in different support services that have been provided to people through supporting people, and I think all these things have led to some real challenges. What I'd always want to emphasise is that when we look at the street population, let's look at it in the entirety, because when we look at the 8,096 individuals who were met by the outreach teams last year sleeping rough, 65% of that group are people who are new to the street. So we've got that group that turn up and have moved on quite quickly. We have no second night out working very effectively for that group. We have another group of about 23% who are the people who have been on the street for a long time, and then another group who return into the streets after being off for a while. So it's very important we look at these groups in different ways. Big success in terms of tackling new arrivals. 55% of rough sleepers have just one connection, one link with an outreach service before they're helped off the street, which is really impressive. But a group who have been on the street for too long, this stock group as we call them.
Sorry, could I just...
Yeah,
so I understand that figure. So you're saying 55% on having one contact with support, then get proper accommodation.
Well, let's be absolutely clear. Of the 55%, that 55% are just met once by outreach teams on the street. So some of them would have been directly helped by outreach teams to get off the street, and others wouldn't have turned up again on the street and may have found their own way off the street. So the very important thing is, for most people we are seeing on the street in central London, indeed across London, there's this very quick early intervention that's very successful. But we do have a significant number, and 23% is a big percentage when you've got 8,000 people on the street. So, you know, a significant number of people have been on the street for more than 2 years. And they're a group that are very vulnerable, and the social impact bond for entrenched rough sleepers that the GLA will be launching will be, I think, a very valuable way of assisting that group. I note this because I think we tend to put rough sleepers into one big pot, and they are so different in terms of their needs. And clearly, Central and Eastern European migrants who are coming to the capital in order to find work have got a different set of needs than people who have been on the street for a long time.
Could I ask Kath Dane as well, so your view on why we're seeing this increase, if you concur with that? Or
I do concur with that.
Yeah.
I think that we're seeing more people on the street that have lost tenancy from the private rented sector. We still are seeing a number of people on the street that have on the street because of a relationship breakdown. We've had the influx of people that are non-UK nationals on the street, and as Jeremy said, we've got people that return to rough sleeping, are very entrenched in rough sleeping. For Tower Hamlets, our street outreach team uses the No Second Night Out service, which I know Dan's going to speak about, quite effectively. And it's really, really important to get to people that are on the street for the first time and get them there and off the street. But yeah,
we'll come back to that,
yeah, absolutely. But I concur. Those are the reasons Jeremy's kind of clearly outlined.
Thank you. So, Assembly Member Curtin, perhaps if you could come in and ask your...
Yeah, sure. Just to follow on from that, I was particularly interested... well, good morning. I was particularly interested in why there's such a high number of non-UK nationals at the moment. And Jeremy, you've answered that a lot, particularly people from Central and Eastern Europe. And one country in particular, Romania, makes up nearly 20% of all rough sleepers in London. Have you got any more to say about the reasons why there's been an increase in people from Europe, particularly Romania, coming since 2010? Maybe ask David and Dan if you've got any comments to make on that.
I think, there has been the growth coming through. I think, as Jeremy mentioned, it is quite often an economic decision why people will come to London in terms of around employment opportunities. We know there are a number of especially Romanian nationals who are working off the books. So we do get encampments, especially in more outer London areas where people are coming for work, are working, and actually their rough sleeping is a consequence of them working, because they're working generally by the day, so they're not actually in legitimate employment. So I think we're seeing kind of a growth of that. I think it is worth noting that those numbers have dropped the last 2 quarters, as Jeremy mentioned. We have seen a drop in since since the decision around Brexit was mentioned, and since the Home Office have changed their policy, there has been a drop. We're not sure whether the two things are linked at this stage. I think it's far too early to say. I mean, I think Dan can probably say more in terms of around Routes Home, the service we commissioned that works specifically with this group.
Yes, I mean, I won't add too much more to the reasons why people are coming here, but I suppose the challenges for that group, for Romanian nationals, for example, is what offer to make people for a return home to the home country, because often sleeping on the streets for small chunks of time in London, earning some money, sending it home, is better than being back in their home country. So the options they have available to them, or the options they perceive they have available to them, are not as good as being here, staying in an encampment or staying on the streets and working. So it's very challenging to make an offer to someone to help them off the streets when they're not necessarily wanting to engage with that offer.
Again, I think it's important to, within that group of Romanians, there's different groups too. So if you look at we do a lot of work, Thames Reach does a lot of work in outer London boroughs where there are encampments of Romanian rough sleepers. One thing I would note is that far from some of the stereotypes around people sponging off of the welfare benefit system, these are people that have got an incredible work ethic. So when we go and meet them, we have to be there at 5 in the morning because they're getting up at 6 in order to work on construction sites, doing gardening jobs, doing car wash jobs, and they're away from the encampment by 6 and they're working a very long shift. Now, the worry about it is, of course, often it's off the cards work. They're not registered to work, and that's a problem. And the money's been sent home. They're managing to get jobs very, very quickly. They're not drifting around London. They're usually in a very localised position in the capital. And we've just done a piece of research, actually, shortly to be launched around encampments, because that isn't a situation that can continue, partly because, obviously, these people are open to exploitation at one end of things. They're certainly getting paid below minimum wage, and are given the worst jobs on site. But also, these are public spaces, aren't they? These are parks they're sleeping rough in, and in order to support communities, we also have to do something about those encampments. I don't know what the solution is, actually, because in a way, the outreach workers can't provide the normal support we would to vulnerable people. They're there to talk to people, and obviously many of my colleagues can speak the languages, and we employ people who from Central and Eastern Europe to work with us. But I think ultimately that is a real challenge, and one of the proposals that people have put up is some very, very basic accommodation for that group. That brings its challenges too, because that could create an incentive for more people to come over. So this is one where I think for us it's a dilemma and a work in progress in terms of tackling the issues, because it cannot be enough to close sites down to see people displaced to a park half a mile away.
So these will be people really who are desperate to earn a bit of money to send back to Romania, but are willing to work, in jobs that are, that would be below minimum wage.
Exactly.
So
you get up from the camp, you go up at Wicks. This is literally the situation where people are going, where the men in the vans are going to get their materials to do a job. You get picked up. There's a bit of haggling. You go on and do the job on site. And they're regarded as, absolutely got the work ethic, so they're valuable members of the workforce in those ways, in those terms. But of course, open to exploitation, all the issues around health and safety that you'd naturally be concerned about for this group are there, and they are returning money home. So it's in many ways they're regarded as successful in their own communities back in Romania.
would they be people who would take the help of no first night out or no second night out, or are they more people that you'd put in the category of long-term rough sleepers?
I mean, the people that I've met, they won't accept the offer because the offer would be generally to help them to return home.
Okay.
And they don't want to return home. So if they're working, which again I concur with Jeremy, people will move and they'll set up encampments generally around areas where they can, there is a Wix located, or there is, a kind of an employment site. So we see many fewer people in Tower Hamlets because we don't have that sort of those employment opportunities. But if you offer things to people, they're scared of services. They don't want to go to no second night out because the offer is to return back to Romania. And
I've gone out both with Thames Reach and St Mungo's to Romania to look at what the resources are like there, what the partnerships are like. There's been funding for transnational partnerships, funding for places that people can return to, but it's very minimal offer back home. So people don't, they're not taking up our offers here because they're not what they want. They want free accommodation so they can continue working and send things home. And there is that one group. I mean, we do have other people from we have other Romanians that aren't working, and we have other people from across Europe who aren't working. And on an individual basis, we're offering them support services back home, and sometimes they take those, and sometimes, we work with the Home Office around enforcement.
There's a gap for this client group as well in terms of what offer we can make them here. People who are often coming here are work ready, but their access to welfare benefits has changed, so they can't access welfare benefits. So they're in a bit of a bind where they are work ready, but they've got no accommodation to be able to stay, to be able to then access benefits and support and access accommodation. So as Kath was saying, the options that we can offer are really, really limited. And often people are put off by coming into services like No Second Night Out because amidst their communities, they may say, if you're offered this service, don't take it because it means an automatic reconnection, which isn't always the case because we assess each case on a case-by-case basis to see what their merits and entitlements are. It's not always a return home. Sometimes people are entitled to services in the UK, and often we've got people who are they haven't just arrived, they've been in accommodation and lived here for many years, and their entitlements have changed and they've fallen out of accommodation. And then the offer to them, someone who's been here 8-10 years, of a return home is very, very difficult when you've built a life in the UK.
I think our research was recently done did show that most of the people we talked to would be prepared to work legally on the cards, and they would be prepared to pay for accommodation, but the kind of amount they want to pay is £8 a night, £8-9 a night. So, as we know, that's very hard to
really
pull
available
off
in
in
London.
London.
I've got one more question. I mean, Jeremy, you said earlier that, and David as well, that the number is slightly going down in the last couple of quarters. With Britain coming out of the European Union, which will happen in the next couple of years, do you see that figure going down, continue to go down before the exit actually takes place? And I mean, how do you see the figures, the number of people sleeping rough, particularly from the European Union, changing before Brexit actually happens over the next 2 years, and then perhaps afterwards as well, after 2019?
I think at this stage it's so difficult to know for sure. Like I say, we've seen this slight reduction in the past 2 quarters, but we don't know whether that is going to continue. And talking to wider colleagues in national government, talking to colleagues in the Home Office, they don't know what the situation is going to be in terms of immigration and individuals coming to this country, whether it's going to go up just before Brexit, just before that stage, or whether actually what we're seeing now is going to be an ongoing trend and actually numbers are going to continue to drop. I think it's far too early for us to say. It's also far too early for us to say what happens when that does take place, in terms of what will be people's rights, how will that all work. And so we need to work with colleagues in the Home Office to try and work out and map out actually when that does happen, what does that mean for us in terms of around services, what does that mean for people that are coming to this country who might happen to end up rough sleeping, what should our service offer be for those individuals. We also need to be mapping that out as well. So I think, unfortunately, it's a bit too early for us to say at this stage.
But also, I keep going with my theme about looking at the detail. The Polish rough sleeping figures have been 8 to 9% of the rough sleeping population now for about 3 years. So I think each national group needs to be looked at slightly differently. And I was reading in the paper this week, actually last week, how the flow of Poles overall coming to the country has begun to change in the other direction. So it could be that in terms of us working rough sleepers, we pick up on these trends a bit earlier than the national figures, where obviously there's time lag in terms of the data.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Berry.
Didn't he want to ask something about the EU nationals? Because I wanted to go back
well,
to
it was just going back to clarify something Dan said about, it's on this point.
Yeah.
Which was, you just on the group, you said they weren't able or willing to pay more than £8 a night. Is that what you said?
Well, we did a piece of research and we asked them, would you be prepared to come into accommodation rather than sleeping rough? The answer was yes, and given how much they earn, we then said, what kind of amount would you be prepared to pay per night? And that was the figure that they were coming up with, £8 or £9 a night for accommodation. And then obviously they're talking there about very, very basic accommodation.
Yeah. And you couldn't help them with that?
Well, I think it's something, personally, I think it's something that we have to go away and reflect on, because at the moment the situation is, it can't continue as it is in those, particularly in those outer London boroughs where we have those encampments. But there is the dilemma about, first of all, creating an incentive, because providing that accommodation for that group in particular may be seen by people in those countries as a way of making it easier when you come here. But also, in terms of the numbers, if we created some dormitory accommodation for 25 people, then that would get filled very quickly. And also, the deal would have to be, if you're coming into this accommodation, you need to legalise your position. Because what neither Thames Regional or any of the bodies represented here would want to collude in a situation where people are working off the cards with all the problems that brings. At one level, at one extreme, people can get into situations which in the end become forced labour situations where they have got very, very few rights indeed. And that's troubling.
Just on the point of incentive.
So the people who are being, so to speak, offered, help to go home, deported, whatever, they're all illegal.
Well, they're not being deported, and when they're offered the chance to go home, the vast majority, the work we do is around voluntary reconnection. So wherever we can, we say to people, look, this situation is clearly deteriorating. Can we connect you back with your family and community in Poland, in Romania? And if necessary, we will go with people to help them reconnect. And if there's additional problems around alcohol, for example, somebody will be detoxed before they go on the return. So that's the main position. Of course, if people have been on the street for a long time, haven't fulfilled their treaty obligations around getting into work, then eventually they're going to come to the attention of immigration compliance and enforcement and are going to be administratively removed. But, we're, if you like, dealing with the issues that arise from migration policies rather than in any way being responsible for them.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'd like to ask a couple more questions about the overall statistics that we asked about at the beginning. I noticed from the briefing that we've been given that only 15% of the people sleeping rough are female, are women. Can you tell us more about that, and what are the factors that mean so many of the rough sleepers are men, and what are women doing instead?
I think it's where, the stats you got, I think you had were for the count rather than from Jane, but I think both Jane or equally tells a kind of a relatively similar story. What we know is that often women will be more hidden, so won't necessarily be found in terms of in relation to rough sleep, and quite often actually are in very more insecure housing and basically taking it in that. So that route, that's the reason in terms of explaining it. In terms of looking at why there's a growth in terms of men, quite often, as Kath mentioned earlier, it's often around relationship breakdowns, it's often around debt, and things like that cause people to actually end up rough sleeping. Quite often those issues affect men greater than they affect women quite often, and those women that will be then more insecurely housed. So we see, we've done a piece of research recently, Thames Reach did it for us in terms of London Street Rescue, looking at buses and people on buses, and actually found a huge more number of women who are travelling on the night buses than actually would be picking up in terms of being actually seeing rough sleeping. So I think that's part of the reason.
Yeah, I think traditionally, over the years, that figure stayed around 10 to 15%. Women are scared to rough sleep, and they will look for generally any other option. So we have women that will be staying in very violent relationships that we only then sort of are able to support once we find out that they've left and gone to the street. Women will sex work and find somebody to stay with. Will stay with punters rather than rough sleep because it's so dangerous. So the women that we find often that are rough sleeping have such complex issues, have multiple high needs, because it is the absolute last resort.
And this is my concern, that the factors that lead to homelessness are still there, but the people are not actually rough sleeping, so they're harder to find. We're going to do a whole investigation into homelessness, but I think that will be an issue.
Yeah. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back to the issue about people who are from a variety of European backgrounds who've come here and now, for whatever reason, have found themselves sleeping rough. And you were implying either that there might be some issues about their immigration status, but more specifically, you seem to be implying also that a number of them might be working off the books and therefore working illegally. So that means that there are employers in London who are employing people illegally. Are you aware of any programmes to tackle people who are breaking the law in terms of employing people off the books? Is question one.
There's been some work done in Brent, who set up used legislation to look at going after those employers. So they actually set up a zone around their local whips and basically been doing some work around individual employers. That's the very early stage, if not, and they can only do it around certain areas. It's obviously quite resource intensive. I don't think they've managed to take anyone so far actually through to court and like that, but they've managed to do some warnings, managed to do some work around that. We've had conversations with HMRC in terms of looking at would they be interested in taking us a little bit further from their side. So obviously it's quite a low number, if you know what I mean, of organisations, quite a low number of employers. Their indication at that stage was they weren't willing to look at actually looking at this in more depth, which is unfortunate. So I think boroughs themselves have taken approaches around individual areas to try and see whether there's something you can do.
You seem to be saying that there are employers in London at this moment in time who are breaking the law almost with impunity, and that nothing is being done and they're not being prosecuted for employing people in these circumstances, because that then creates, a magnet for people to come here. And you're talking about people being willing to pay about £56 a week, maybe £60 a week for accommodation. The other side of that is how much money are they planning to send home? Because, they're being paid, off the books, and they themselves also keep trying to send money home in a lot of cases. So we've got a very strange situation where employers are being allowed to attract people to this country and then employing them in that way and then putting them into this position where they're really unable to fulfil their accommodation requirements because they're underpaying them probably as well.
Yes, I mean this has been going on in London for decades rather than a few years,
Sure.
I'd say. But with this particular group, also the employers are small employers, so they're employing a few people, and it has been terribly difficult to tackle that. There have been some efforts. I think actually was it in a West London borough they had a public spaces protection order actually out around people being picked up for work. Is that right? That's true.
Yeah, they did.
Wasn't it? But even when I can think of a high profile case where the employer, and in this situation it was an employer that had a very big workforce, was legal action was taken against them, not just for employing people on below minimum wage, but actually there was clear evidence of forced labour. Even in that situation, it was incredibly difficult to bring a court case that was successful against them. So I think it is, in legal terms, it seems to be a real challenge.
I think it's really unsatisfactory if we don't
To help Assembly Member Cooper,
tackle this.
the Assembly last year, or year before last, unanimously adopted a motion that said there needed to be more proactive work being done by HMRC in order to enforce the minimum wage, because at the moment they're relying too much on workers complaining. Now, none of them workers are going to complain, because if they complain they'll be out.
Surely all you need is
but it's certainly.
I mean, we've tackled it in the larger employers because obviously there was historically a huge number of people that got used on building sites who were, the lump, all the rest of it. And we then discovered that anyone who tried to unionise on building sites was being blacklisted. And so there's been a whole history of that. So I think for larger employers, I'm fairly sure, I could mention a number of large building companies now who are employing people from all over Europe and all over the UK. They are all, they go through all the health and safety, they're properly employed and all the rest of it. So I think we've stamped it out with probably in the larger employers for the main part. I find it very interesting that you're talking about the smaller employers. I'm heartened to hear that there's been something done in the past, but I think tying it together with the fact that we've now got 8,000 people that we know of rough sleeping, you know, that is actually a huge burden on London and Londoners, and local authorities becoming involved in it. It's a burden on local authorities. Sorry to...
No.
Yeah.
Well, that's some HMRC officers in plain clothes at Wicks.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
You're catching them red-handed. I mean,
I can absolutely
Absolutely.
guarantee if you go into the car park at Wicks in Barking at the moment, you're going to find people collecting.
But just to emphasise the point you made, actually, this would not make you popular with the people queuing up for the work, because they're getting £50 for a day's work, and by their standards, that is more than they can earn in a day, in a week.
but we shouldn't be encouraging exploitative labour practices, even if they're willing to be exploited.
If there
It's
were
not on.
more enforcement, if we made it really difficult to employ people for less than the minimum wage, do you think that would address some of the problems related to this sucking noise that London has for, for people to come here and try their hand?
Yes, and I think that some employers would carry on employing the people, the Romanians that we were talking about, because they provide it's a very hard day's work. Others would stop employing them though. So that's how it would be seen, if you like, from the position of the people who are queuing up for the work. They would feel they wouldn't have the same opportunities, and that's probably right.
Yeah, well,
That's the dilemma.
the law
I'm only
should apply to
stating
Law should
everyone.
apply to everybody.
It should,
Yeah,
doesn't matter
it's-
who they are, it should apply.
Absolutely.
Let's move on, because we're obviously
Chair.
we're into that subject. Absolutely. Assembly Member Copley.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is to Cathworth and then to David, and it's about the homelessness reduction bill. Obviously, local authorities have a duty to house people who are vulnerable at the moment, and if the homelessness reduction bill becomes law, it's going to place additional duties upon local authorities to assist those at risk of becoming homeless. How will local authorities respond to the bill when budgets are already strained? That's the Cath first.
Well, I think we're shaking in our boots.
Shaking in your boots.
I mean, within Tower Hamlets, the City of London and London Borough of Hackney, we have secured some funding to pilot the No First Night Out project, which is around prevention, is moving further upstream, and is trying to look at how we could respond when this bill becomes law. And I think that the money that we're seeing dedicated into the pot...
That's
across
mayoral
London.
money, is it, as opposed to government funding? or is it
The
from
money that we have to pilot
Yeah.
is mayoral money.
Is mayoral money, yeah.
But we also have some money from the DCLG
Right.
that we've put together for this pilot. The money that is being dedicated going forward, this sort of 61 million that's been offered up across England, is nowhere near enough to help us to meet the burden that's going to come through to us. So you're asking me how we're going to do it in the future.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is that we're going to be looking at the pots of money in the future, but so far what's been dedicated will not stretch to being for us across the local authorities to be able to meet the duties that are going to be imposed.
I think the estimate was for London, I think it was a London Council's estimate, £161 million. If, and maybe that's a slightly at the high end, but certainly the gap between that and what the government are offering for the whole country is very big. If you've got these duties placed on you and you've got no money to be able to deal with it, what's going to happen? Is it just that you're simply not going to be able to fulfil your duties? And is there going to be then legal recourse from people against local authorities?
Yes, I think that is a real possibility. What we're trying to do at the moment is find ways to move further upstream in prevention so that it won't cost as much in terms of a temporary accommodation or move on accommodation. If we can help people to kind of save their tenancies and remain in accommodation or mediate to keep them at home, then it won't cost as much sort of in the next, if we can do the prevention duty well, then the sort of relief duty won't cost as much. But there is a significant issue that we're facing in terms of the lack of funding that so far is going to be dedicated.
And presumably because the trial and No First Night, you're ahead of the curve in many ways in Tower Hamlets. Other boroughs will be in a worse position in terms of being able to deal with this.
Yeah, I think we've got quite a bit of learning and we starting to understand what the real costs are going to be. And I think that we are going to be able to respond, but we are still going to be in the same position as other local authorities if we don't have enough sort of dedicated funding to meet those duties. We will still be in the same position as others.
I think everybody, well, certainly most people I know agree with the principle of the homelessness reduction bill. Very good
Absolutely.
in principle.
We are all in agreement.
If you get, if you get the funding from the government, you're very much on board with.
Absolutely, we're really excited about it. I mean, that's why we wanted to get the funding. That's why we wanted to pilot it. We wanted to see what it would be like if we had 3 boroughs together and we could pool resources. We face in Housing Options a tsunami of need coming in every day. And we're trying to find solutions for people every day, as the voluntary sector is. So we are completely on board about wanting to support individuals. It's, that's not the issue. The issue is having enough resources to do it at all and to do it well.
David, if I could bring you in now, I mean, if you could comment on that, and also perhaps potentially if there's any support that the Mayor could be providing.
Sure, I mean, I think it's important as well as the bill to look at the drivers behind homelessness and look at more the long-term kinds of solutions and long-term solutions to issues. I think otherwise, whereas if you just focus purely on the bill, then we get wrapped up in constantly looking at TA costs, constantly looking at that. We need to be building more homes, if you know what I mean. We need to be making sure there's more affordable homes that are being built across London to be able to provide the solutions that are more long-term, and that will take time. And I think, if you know what I mean, I think, as the Deputy Mayor said, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I know, we're looking to build more homes, we're looking to build more affordable homes, which will provide the solutions as we ongo. But yeah, the burden is certainly there in terms of when the bill comes through to local authorities. We are concerned that the burden is going to be more than they can actually be able to manage. And we're not looking at funding at this stage. We're waiting to see what comes out from national government. This is a national government initiative. This is their bill. But yeah, we need to be prepared for what might be a difficult change for local authority.
Okay, thank you.
Somebody remember Devonish?
Thank you. My question first of all is for Kath. Is No First Night Out working as you expected, please?
Yes, it's working as we expected. We have been able to help identify a number of people that were at risk of rough sleeping, and being able to provide intensive casework alongside agreements with them to accept offers, personalise the service, and help move people into TA and into long-term accommodation. So there is some success. I guess some of the learning for us is around how much the welfare reforms are having on the client group. And when we're placing people, particularly under 35, into temporary accommodation that are now on universal credit, they're building up extensive arrears. And that is something people will be carrying with them rather than a supportive sort of mechanism. That's something that, longer term is going to be very difficult for people. So we knew that was going to be hard, but we weren't sure how hard. Also, every day we are now getting landlords saying they're not willing to work with us. Letting agencies are not willing to work with us because they will not take people on universal credit. They will not take the risk any longer in terms of not having a guaranteed income, of not knowing when they're going to get paid, because the money moves from paying the individual landlords direct to the client. And we used to be able to say this person's vulnerable and here's what we're doing to support them. And landlords are saying, well, we're not guaranteed income, we're not going to rent any longer. And we're finding it harder and harder to find places within the London Housing Allowance as well that will accept our client group. So the barriers, one of the learnings is that anyone taking on a prevention programme and looking at No First Night Out, which is quite a few local councils across the country, in groups or individually, they need to be thinking about accommodation pathways up front. So, we had some ideas there, and we had some things in place, but those learnings are quite stark at the moment.
Thank you. David, same question, please.
I think I think it's been interesting what we've learned. I think it's interesting in terms of the toolkit that Sam has been, if you know, maybe, but No First Now has been developing to look at which of those individuals that come through the door will actually end up rough sleeping, and trying to actually define those groups, because we know a number of people will come to housing options, but will be able to sort out their own situation individually without ending up rough sleeping. So I think the work that's been done around the toolkit there to look at actually how can you try and work out which individuals are most at risk is a very useful thing. We've also, I think, learnt a little bit from that for our Safe Connections bid that we put into DCLG. So we've got additional funding from DCLG for Safe Connections work, which is going to commence hopefully in October, which will look around those individuals who don't fall into no second night out groups. So the people on the streets who've got 2 to 10 street contacts have accepted their single service offer, but are struggling to get it away from the streets because they can't find the PRS accommodation that they can afford. They can't get into the supported housing that they should be, that they're eligible for, but they're on a waiting list. And so we're looking at having a team of workers who can do that casework. So basically the outreach team don't need to be doing that casework during the day. There'll be a dedicated team that's able to help unpick those knocks, because we know if you chase boroughs, if you chase PRS, you can achieve the outcome. And those groups, unfortunately, at the moment are staying a bit longer and therefore becoming more entrenched. Their support needs to get in higher, and that's where you get you get more of the entrenched group that Jeremy mentioned earlier. So I think that's what we've learned very much so from No First Night Out, and we're keen to hopefully bring as a pan-London service from October.
Thanks. I'll leave it there because I'm sure colleagues want to come in on this one.
Assembly Member Berry.
Yeah, sure. I do have a few more questions about No First Night Out. I think it's really like a valiant effort to do some prevention work. There seem to be quite a lot of factors. I'm looking at the toolkit examples that we've been given, and the people coming into No First Night Out they're not homeless. They have a housing at the moment, but they're at risk of homelessness. A lot of them are being evicted by private landlords. And it seems to me that the best solution is to find them something similar to what they've already got. But looking at the flow chart of the 24 clients that were helped, I think only 8 or 10 ended up in the similar accommodation to where they started out. A lot of them ended up in hostels or bed and breakfast, the kind of accommodation where somebody would go if they were already homeless. You see what I mean? So how is it working out in terms of the difference between because they are not. The whole point of prevention is to stop people getting into a position where they are on the streets and extremely vulnerable. These people are at risk. They're not actually homeless.
We're moving further upstream in the work to look at when people come into housing options. Is it the day before they become homeless, or is it 2 months before they become homeless, or is it 6 months before they become homeless? And trying to move to work with people 2 months before they become homeless to keep those tenancies secure. But what we're finding is we're working with people that are imminently going to be rough sleeping. That is the kind of cohort at the moment. And people then leave their accommodation, and we are finding them temporary solutions. So the bed and breakfast solution, the going into a hostel, is something, it's not the long-term solution. So this program's been running since the 1st of April, and we haven't, a number of the people that are in temporary will be moving into the PRS once they've sort of had the support and once we've been able to identify PRS. We've had a partnership with Crisis. They're able to secure some very good quality flats, and we have our own internal procurement within the local authority. But we need to make the offer, as we do to Romanians, we need to make the offer to landlords, something that they want to take up. And with the partnership that we have with Crisis, they offer pre-tenancy support, and they also offer post-tenancy support while those people have moved into the private rented sector. So landlords that are willing to accept people on universal credit or within the London LHA rates, there is then an offer to help people through that. So I think what I want to say is it's a new program. We haven't moved everybody immediately into PRS. Some of those people that have come in and lost their tenancies also have other support needs. And through the time that they were facing a homelessness, their housing crisis, their mental health has suffered. There other needs have developed. So people have been moved into hostels to get that support.
Now I'm a local councillor as well as an assembly
Yeah.
member, so this is my so much of my casework is
Yeah.
these kinds of issues now. So then my next question is how are you finding people then? I mean, if you say you're mainly seeing people who are imminently at risk of homelessness, what efforts are you making to get referrals a bit earlier, maybe from, I mean, there's going to be the duty of people in public services to identify people. Is that going to help?
Well, I think it is going to help. I mean, in the first phase of this work was obviously identifying the characteristics of which individuals, as David mentioned, individuals that would become homeless and what sort of factors would really push them into rough sleeping, so what personal circumstances. And we had developed the toolkit and rolled that out to our housing option services across the 3 boroughs. The second phase was to work in partnership with other agencies across the tri-borough area that wouldn't necessarily, that don't offer sort of housing advice or generally work with, have any specialist expertise in homelessness, and work with them. So a very good partnership that we've developed in one sense is with the DWP. So within the housing coaches within the DWP, the employment coaches will identify people that have mentioned something about an insecure housing situation. They will do a very brief assessment and they will then refer over to our No First Night Out workers. And that's an example where we're trying to catch people in different areas, in different agencies that are starting to identify individuals. We're developing a relationship with East London Mosque in Tower Hamlets and talking to them about how do they identify people, or they hear something, how will they refer over to us. We've got health services, probation services, so we're widening the net. Also to other local agencies, the legal advice or people that offer CABs. So we're sort of moving further upstream in the partnerships.
Yeah, that sounds really positive. And universal credit, that sounds like that's going to be a big issue. That's there's hardly any people on that now, but that's coming quite.
We've got the pilot in Poplar, so that's how we know it's going to have a huge impact on finding landlords and being able to support people.
Is it going to have an impact on people's ability to pay?
To pay, absolutely. Yeah, I mean the amount of rent versus how much people will be getting in benefits. Sometimes it leaves people can't even pay the rent, or it leaves them so little even to pay bills they have nothing to live on. Nothing.
Okay. Shall I carry on to the next question?
Just on No First Night Out, does the Mayor actually have a target with regard to No First Night Out? Because it sounds like the problem is with the title, it seems to be like a target, which means if you have one person spending a night out, you've failed.
Yes, no, there's no, because it was very much a pilot, there are a number of, we obviously kind of contract monitor it with Tower Hamlets to look at the performance of it, but no, there was no specific target around No First Night Out. I think it is worth mentioning in terms of the DCLG wider funding that's recently come out, their Trailblazers initiative. The majority that was mainly focused at No First Night Out. No First Night Out was referenced within that documentation for what they were looking at, and London has been successfully getting about £6 million of that funding for various boroughs and various partnership boroughs to trial more No First Night Out kind of prevention work. But in terms of a target, no, there wasn't a direct.
I mean, it's usual territory for us, for this mayor, not to have a target on anything. The previous mayor had a target on no second night out, failed to meet it, but came close to it. So at least they was heading for something. Isn't there an advantage in having a target?
Of course. And in terms of, like say, for No Second Night Out, we do have targets for all of our other commission services. We have very specific targets. We have payment by results targets in most of our contracts now moving forward. So we have very specific targets. I think for No First Night Out, which was commenced during the previous administration, and that's when it was set up in its infancy, was looking at actually this is a development piece of work. We don't know exactly how many people it's going to be able to see. We don't know how many people we're going to be able to prevent. So to put a target on it at that early stage seems a bit So
We
a
did.
bit too early on. I mean, I think also it's worth saying in terms of around universal credit, the impact that this might potentially have on No Second Night Out and on our more immediate services. We know that actually having that gap, because basically what you're going to have in terms of universal credit is a gap before that claim can be made.
Yeah.
So you're going to have a month's gap, which for No Second Night Out is going to have a huge impact, because actually the routes out of No Second Night Out are often into PRS. We're trying to get more and more individuals out into PRS. If you can't claim benefits as an individual for a month, then actually that means we are likely to potentially get clogged up at No Second Night Out currently, and you know more about Dan than I do. But
Yeah, I mean, we've got there are some boroughs that are piloting universal credit. So in Hampton and Fulham, we're starting to see people who most of the clients that come through No Second Night Out are having to put their first claim in, or they've had a break in their claims. So it means they're now being moved on to universal credit. And as David said, the gap from putting the claim in, there seems to be a kind of an arbitrary assessment period. And actually nothing happens in that assessment period. It's just a waiting period with an assessment at the end of it. So that assessment really, you know, for this cohort of people needs to be at the beginning, because they don't mirror the average working person, which is what universal credit is going to set up.
There's no option for discretionary funds in there.
there is potentially, and we're talking to central government about how the impact it will have on this client group in particular, and the impact on these services. So they are kind of listening, but at the moment we still need to get that put through, because otherwise our worry is that we're already seeing people staying longer at No Second Night Out than we would like, because the routes out are getting more and more difficult, and this would just put a further block.
Even with discretionary funding in the meantime, it might help someone with their welfare in terms of buying food or that kind of thing. But in terms of going back to Kath's point about convincing a landlord that I'm going to be a suitable tenant, and going to a landlord with uncertain benefit status, you might be on some discretionary payments, but there's not been a decision made on your kind of longer term entitlements. There's going to be few to no landlords that will accept someone in that position.
Just one other point, if you don't mind bearing with me. One of the things that this committee will be looking at is hidden homelessness. Those people who don't feature as rough sleeping, but perhaps are on the verge of becoming rough sleepers. To what extent do you see this as a problem as well? The sofa surfers, the people who are in unregulated accommodation.
I think it is potentially a big issue. I think it's very difficult at the moment to have any hard stats on how big an issue it is. I think there's been some research done in the past. Crisis has done some research. Various organisations have done some research, but it's been quite small in its kind of overarching look, and it's very difficult to draw out conclusions from a very small piece of research. So I think we don't know what the scale of the issue is currently. And obviously we know in terms of around rough sleeping, we're very lucky in London to have the chain, so we know in terms of which individuals are on the streets. We don't know what's going on in terms of around individuals who are more insecurely housed. You hear of the information coming through housing options, so boroughs know a little bit more in terms of around that insecure housing, but I think it's definitely an area that's worth looking at for the Assembly to find out more about.
Is there an established, I mean, I don't know if it's a term that you particularly use, hidden homelessness, but is there such a, is there an established definition that you use?
In terms of it would be people that are insecurely housed. So those people that are sofa surfing, those people that are staying with individuals for a night, staying with family and friends for evenings. Yes, we would. So yes, there is that definition. There is anything there, but I think in terms of at the moment we've been very much focused on rough sleeping and dealing with the issues that are on the streets rather than.
Can I just ask on that, is there a certain number of nights they need to stay before they're considered to be hidden homeless, or is one night enough in your view?
I think we have to be terribly careful about it, don't we? Because it has to be not only that you're in secure accommodation, but also that you have needs that will prevent you from getting out of that situation. I well remember a government minister explaining to me that between Cambridge and starting as an advisor, he was staying with a friend for 3 months and having to crash on his sofa. That didn't count. I mean, I think there were resources there that would have prevented that person getting into a serious situation. So I think when we look at the hidden homeless figure, we do have to look at it in a broader way. It's not only the insecurity, but people's access to resources and way out of that situation. A length of time wouldn't be enough.
Wouldn't be enough.
Yeah.
Thank you.
As we heard earlier about somebody who was sofa surfing and then went on to a job for 100,000 a year.
Well,
so,
she ended up at the second night out
but
centre
that's a
actually,
little-
but yes, and then she got a job paying
yeah,
100 grand a year.
so it's not, it's more complex than we think.
Yeah.
Assembly Member Berry, if you could carry on.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the Mayor's new No Nights Sleeping Rough Task Force. The previous Mayor had a rough sleeping working group, but while the previous Mayor was in power, there was a big rise in rough sleeping. So I wanted to ask, first of all, what's happened so far with the new Mayor's task force? What have they done, and have there been any benefits? If there's anything changed?
I think we've had one meeting so far. No, I mean it's still very early stages. I think it's worth saying, in the Mayor's Sleeping Group prior to and the old regime worked very successfully. I think the difference is in terms of this group is that it's now meeting less frequently, but going to be more action focused with a number of subgroups in between. So there have been a number of subgroups set up from the first group, which is very much kind of looking at, in terms of reference, looking at the bids that we were putting in terms of into DCLG. So that was kind of the major focus of the first meeting. But then also setting up these subgroups. There's a subgroup around mental health, looking at the mental health support needs on the streets and what can we do to try and break down what are the three major interventions that we need to be looking at and areas we need to be focusing on around helping improve access into mental health services for our client group, and also potential routes out of from acutes, so looking at discharges and things like that. There's also a group that's going to be focused on the data, looking at making sure we're using data more effectively. Another group looking at hostels and to how hostel provision is used across the board. So I think there have been it is a kind of slightly different approach. I think it's very clear we're going to try and have a clear work plan. We're going to try and make the meetings more focused on specific areas and specific themes. So the actual core membership of the group of No Nights Sleeping Rough Task Force, which is quite a mouthful to say, is smaller than actually the previous Mayor's Rough Sleeping Group. Because I think what we're trying to do is actually have a smaller core membership and then actually call in the associates when actually there's areas to talk about that are more relevant to them. So prior to this, in the Mayor's Sleeping Group, we used to invite the police, used to come along, try and come along to every single meeting. You used to have Home Office Immigration Enforcement along to every single meeting they'd be invited to. But if there wasn't something specific on the agenda for them to cover, actually you're in some ways a little bit wasting their time and meaning that you're going to struggle to get their engagement when you actually do need it, because they come to the meeting before there's nothing for them that's relevant for them on the agenda, and then they necessarily could miss when you've got an agenda that is. I mean, I think it's probably worth Jeremy coming in because he actually sits on the task force and has sit on the Mayor's Sleeping Group. He'll probably say more than I can say, obviously.
I think all the members of the panel here are from organisations represented on the task force, is that right?
Yes.
If you could all comment, that would be great. But
Well, I made the chops. I was allowed to stay on the task force group, probably because I'm obsessed by data, so you're going to put me on that data group, aren't you? I think what the previous meeting did well, chaired by Rick Blakeway actually, was to hold us to account in a sense in terms of the figures. So we were looking at the quarterly figures, and you went to the meeting needing to be prepared to answer to the figures, whether they're rising or falling. So I think that was a useful discipline. Like Dave, I think also the downside of the previous meetings we used to have was the number of people attending it. So it took 10 minutes to go around to start the meeting for everybody to introduce themselves. The challenge now is, I think, if we're meeting every 6 months and we're getting this very rich data through the chain database, which I'm told by colleagues internationally is probably the richest data in the world in terms of rough sleeping. We have to really work very successfully between a 6-monthly meeting to respond to that data and to reflect on it and to change our approach according to what that data is telling us. So that would be my concern. I'm very supportive of the subgroups that have been set up, which I think are the right ones. But if I was going to be critical of us both previously under the meeting chaired by Rick Blakeway and the meeting now chaired by James Murray, it is the use of that data. We have to be much more explicit about what we're finding and responding to it. We can't look at it every 6 months and say, that's very interesting, there's been some changes. And whilst over in North America, I think we have, where they've got a much bigger rough sleeping problem, we have to be careful about wanting to learn too much there without being challenging. What they do very well, I think, is to use data, and they do it over a much shorter period of time to concoct plans, make changes in their approach. So that would be my challenge to us all. And also the homelessness sector needs to be much stronger at bringing ideas and demands to that group too. So I think the expectation is that we, as a voluntary sector, do better. And we had a meeting last week, actually, of key people from voluntary sector agencies to actually do that very thing, make more demands on the task force group.
I'm not started because I didn't sit on the previous meeting and I don't sit on the current one, but I would support what Jeremy says in terms of having a much more focused and targeted approach to using the data and information that we've got about different cohorts of clients and different trends and issues that we're experiencing that change over time in London. And I think it seems like a really sensible approach to have subgroups that target and focus on those different areas. So,
Is that data going to include an analysis of the effect of the homelessness reduction bill on what that effect that might have? Because one would hope that we can get rid of the task force because it works so well.
Well, it'd be hard to. The challenge would be looking at the data as it comes through. How much of the change relates to the homelessness reduction bill? Because so much of that bill will be addressing homelessness more broadly, not just rough sleeping. So you can look at the data, but there's still many questions to ask. Now, the people who manage chains within St Mungo's, you can ask them additional questions, and they are very, very sympathetic to that, and very, very able to come back with more answers. So, for example, I asked recently, where were people the month before they slept rough? I didn't know we had that data, but the clever chain people were able to tell me that. So I think it's not only looking at the data, but then asking more questions on top of that to change our approach. We have to keep changing the way we work.
the other thing with the homeless reduction bill, that won't end the need for the task force because it will only address people who've got entitlement in the UK. So where we've got non-UK nationals sleeping rough who have no status or unknown status or complex immigration issues, that's a whole kind of cohort in itself that won't fix the issue for.
So did Tara Hamlets want to make a comment?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think we appreciate the new structure of the task force because I think although there's been just the sort of initial meeting, it's been incredibly effective because there has been a real focus on looking at the funding options with the DCLG, looking at the new programmes going forward for the different cohorts, and that's been very successful. I think also in having sort of small working parties is very, it's very important. You can, in the last administration when we had the big meetings, you could lose, a sense of focus about the particular aspects. What is crucial is to make sure that there's people senior enough from health, mental health, criminal justice system sitting in those working parties and making decisions along with the mayor and other representatives about what resources that you're going to join together to kind of help solve homelessness, both prevent but also absolutely to address rough sleeping.
Member Cooper, would you like to come?
Yes, thank you. I think I was quite surprised to hear that every 6 months, because that doesn't sound very frequent for something that I personally consider to be a crisis. Possibly South West London is more full of people sleeping rough than anywhere else, but I am seeing a huge number of people in my constituency, particularly on the railway bridges and so on and so forth. So I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the frequency of the subgroups, because 6 months doesn't, I'm sure other people listening to this will think that doesn't sound very frequent. Who is actually going to be involved? What is the membership of the subgroups? So on mental health, will that include mind, crisis? Who is going to be involved in the subgroups? And how often are they going to be meeting? And if you say every 6 months for those, I'm going to be actually quite challenging on that, because that really doesn't sound like something that's going to be stepping up and meeting what I personally consider to be a catastrophic increase in rough sleeping.
Those in terms, the subgroups will meet at least twice in between that 6 month period. So plans that they will meet as and when needed to draw up the reports, which will then go to the No Night Sleeping Rough task force. So plans that they will meet in between and meet frequently in between. Yeah, like I say, minimum of twice, but we don't want to be too specific in terms of how frequently those meetings should meet, because actually, in relation to the data meeting, things like that, actually you should be looking at doing stuff virtually. We should be looking at making sure we're looking at those areas. So they meet yeah, they will meet in between at least twice.
To be helpful, could you send us, what the
I can-
subgroups are,
I can send
what
you
their
I can
initial...
send you the terms of reference for each
Yeah.
subgroup, which has who is
Yeah.
attending each group. And like I say, they are specific in terms of for each area. So yes, for the mental health one, yes, we will have directors of acute mental health wards will be on that group, because we know actually one of the crucial things is people being discharged from mental health straight to the streets, which shouldn't happen when someone is sectioned. So we need to make sure we've got the right people, and as Kat said, the right senior people sat on those groups. I think it's also worth mentioning that as well as No Night Sleeping Rough Task Force and the subgroups, we also have the local authority leads meeting, which meets every quarter, which is for the street population leads from each borough, who commission their own outreach teams, ourselves to come to then look at what are the specific issues in terms of more on the streets. I think the move to the 6 months, yes, if, I understand you guys look and go, well, that seems like you're disinvesting the amount of time. I think what we were keen to do is for that meeting to focus more on the strategic elements and actually focus on what are the strategic issues that are causing rough sleeping, to make it more focused on specific areas. Actually, what are we going to do about solving those issues? The subgroup should work in between to basically look at those issues in more detail, but then bring them to the group to say, actually, these are the 4 main reasons why individuals on the streets, mental health needs are very high, and what we can do to try and resolve those. These are the 4 solutions we can look at, and then the groups decide
I'm
what
feeling
are
a
those
lot
areas.
more reassured. I mean, I understand what you're saying about not wanting to meet too frequently for the more strategic group, but we passed a motion in the Assembly before Christmas, which Assembly Member Copley and I moved, and we talked about, the reasons why some groups are and remain still overrepresented amongst homeless people. And I haven't heard you say anything about a group looking at how it is that so many young people leaving care end up on the streets, how so many people who are LGBT end up on the streets, or indeed how many people who are being discharged from the armed forces end up on the streets. Are those also going to be covered by subgroups looking at those specific groups? Because I wouldn't want us to have to wait 6 months and look at some statistics and then say, oh gosh, perhaps we should have done something.
They potentially will be, yes, if in terms of the priorities will come up from the group as to where we think the group are most needs. I think it's worth saying in terms of around the armed forces side of things that actually only 3% of those individuals on the streets are from UK armed forces. If you're looking at the wider stat in terms of around armed force history, full stop, it is a little bit higher, but those are individuals from the UK armed forces at 3%, and the provision for those individuals is actually very good in terms of what services are available for UK armed forces, people leaving the UK armed forces. So I think it can be seen as a little bit of a red herring in terms of around the armed forces side of things. Other areas, yes, we're looking at, and the data group will help in terms of around that to look at what areas we should be focusing on. What are the main drivers coming through? I think, as Jeremy said, we're very lucky having the chain database. It gives us a huge wealth of data. Making sure we're using that data effectively, making sure we're asking the right questions is what we're keen to do. So in the new chain contract, we're able to actually ask for 2 pieces of research to be carried out every single year. We want to make sure those areas are focused on the right areas, that we're focusing on the major issues. So I think the plan was for the first task force, we don't want to overburden by actually having so many subgroups that it ends up being scattergun. So we're like, right, let's focus on the 4 main areas that we're looking at in terms of the subgroups for this time. Let's have those meetings, let's look at those, and then let's look at other areas and making sure we're focusing on the right areas that it moves through.
Well, thank you very much. That's very helpful and good to receive the information as well. Thanks, Andrew.
I just want to emphasise too that how many meetings do take place in terms of, on a sub-regional basis, looking at issues around rough sleeping, with those boroughs on that sub-regional level, really working closely together and very effectively together. But also on a local level, the street outreach teams and the local authorities and other partners will be looking at individual people sleeping rough and coming up with plans for each of those individuals. So we have the regional, we have the sub-regional, and we have the local. And the local is very, very detailed in terms of the numbers of people. But also, we are very concerned about issues of people leaving care, of course, and all kinds of levels of disadvantage that we see in our work around particular groups. If we're going to be really, really focused on being driven by the data and the facts that we get through the chain, then yes, we're not going to be focusing on ex-services personnel when that figure is 8% of the rough sleeping population. We will be looking more at the 34% of the rough sleeping population that were in prison. And that doesn't mean that one is being neglected. It just means that in terms of priorities, if we're serious about ending rough sleeping, we have to look at those big figures. and that's the challenge.
Dane?
Yeah, I think I just want to add to that. In terms of the sort of London level, the regional level, and the local level. So, you know, I attend the Leeds meeting every quarter with all the leads, and we look very clearly at what's going on in each of our boroughs, what the trends are, what the particular needs are, where the gaps are, and we put that together with the GLA and feed up to the task force. I sit on the East London Delivery Board, so we look at what's happening within our region. Also have cross-borough meetings, either every 2 months or every quarter with the city and with Hackney. We have hotspot meetings about all the border areas. I chair a monthly meeting that looks at hotspots within the borough and individual case plans. I mean, we look at both trends and individuals and the hotspots and the sort of feed up. So that's why I like this structure, because I think that instead of, you know, it's more important to get all the people talking at the right levels and get the information fed up rather than having lots of meetings that may be less effective.
Somebody Member Gavron, you wanted to come in on this
Yes,
point?
I just wanted to come in. It's just because we're talking about chain and data. I suppose it's for Jeremy, but there's one broad group that you haven't given us any stats on. And I did notice a few years ago that with the welfare cuts, it was just really going up. And that was the numbers of young people, and you know, it was under 18 and then under 25. Can you just tell us that? Just be useful to know.
Well, the figures around young people are very interesting because is it 11% of the rough sleeping population now under 25? Is that kind of figure?
Sorry,
11% are under 25. I think that was the latest figures we've got. So the issues facing young people are different. Lots of issues around homelessness in general. We've talked about sofa surfing and hidden homelessness. It is very much relatively smaller numbers of under 25-year-olds coming onto the street. So we've actually seen more over 55-year-olds on the street than under 25-year-olds. And this astonishing figure around the number of 18-year-olds met by all the outreach teams across London working last year, 4 individuals, okay? And it's been that kind of level for a long time. So in one way, we have a very successful system in terms of addressing very young people on the street, which isn't to say that there's not enormous issues facing young people in terms of discrimination around benefits, employment and broader housing issues. But when I was in Chicago last year, seeing very young children with their parents, apparently with their parents, begging on the street in large numbers, is thankfully something we're not seeing yet in London, and I very much hope we never will. So I think that's the young person's perspective. That's my perspective of the young person situation.
Somebody Member Devenish.
When David sends his paperwork, could he include a nice simple org chart? And in the org chart, can we agree that this is borough-led very much, supported by all the excellent organisations on the panel and others, with you guys coming up with strategic vision, problem solving, perhaps in consultation, and more importantly coming up with money from government, but very much borough-led?
Now, thank you for that. Assembly, we're still on Assembly Member Berry's question. Is there anything else you want to come back on your question?
No, I think I'm good. I mean, I was going to ask you, are there any challenges in implementing what the task force comes up with across London? But I think it's kind of covered by the next section on funding to some extent, so we should just move.
Pick it up at the end if there's anything we don't cover. So, Assembly Member Gavron, if you can ask
this
your
is
question.
just in terms of funding, there seem to be, listening to this and reading our briefing, there seem to be many different sources of funding which can either prevent rough sleeping or help people who are rough sleeping. But they all seem to be pretty short term. Now, that's a perception. Is that accurate? And does that prevent them being effective? I'll ask David first.
I think obviously in terms of from GLA, we're very fortunate in being in a position where, yes, we have got our budget, if you know what I mean. I think the new administration will be very clear that this budget is to be ring-fenced and very, very clearly ring-fenced for rough sleeping, which is really positive in terms of what we're doing. We've got a commissioning framework that lasts for the next 4 years that's very much focused on services. So the services that we're commissioning the budget is there for, which is really good. I think there is concern potentially around local authorities and the impact the squeeze might have in terms of local authority budget. It is a complex funding picture. So there are services that we provide, there are services local authorities provide, there are services that charities provide through their voluntary donations as well. So it's a very difficult, complex picture. But I think what we're very good at in London is trying to bring all those areas together to making sure we're focusing on the right areas and providing the right services in the right places. So the commission services that that I oversee in terms of for the mayor, in terms of round, are very much focused on those people that are new to the streets, so no second night out, also pan-London initiatives such as Chain, Clearinghouse. So we make sure we're trying to have as much of a patchwork quilt to cover the area, but it is difficult, and it is difficult in terms of looking at wider budgets and the impact that it's going to have on that.
Okay, we go down. Kath.
I mean, I think we've been very fortunate to be able to have our homelessness grant, prevention grant from the DCLG kept at the same level, fairly at the same level, pretty much for the last several years, and there's no sort of indication that that's going to decrease. However, within the local authority, the cuts that we have to make across the board mean that the impact on our supported housing sector, our hostel sector, is quite notable. So the options that people have in terms of supported accommodation is going to be impacted. Tower Hamlets, with the Corporation of London and Hackney, we work very closely with the GLA. The Safe Connections work came out of the No First Night Out pilot, so we're very pleased that that's been a successful bid. Really excited about it, really excited about sort of seeing how we can make the best out of what we have and make it most effective. But I think it would be certainly our support housing sector.
Do you want to come in?
Me?
Yeah, Dan, on it.
Dan or Jeremy? Me?
Well,
Jeremy.
Dan, I was thinking.
Me. I've got lots to add. I mean, I suppose in terms of the length of time of
Short-termism.
short-termism, I mean, it's difficult to run a successful project over 2-3 years at times. It depends on what the project is, I suppose. And it depends what you do with it. I mean, some initiatives like the No First Night Out initiative is short-term funding. However, the impact it's had in terms of a demonstrable model that can be replicated, and there's been, as David mentioned earlier, there's been a number of successful bids in London for trailblazers, etc., and prevention models. It's what you do in that short term with the project that's important. But it depends on the project. For an organisation like us, if you've got a year to deliver a project and then there's no continuation funding, it's very difficult.
Can I just, if you don't mind, what can we do about that? What can we do about making this more? What changes should there be in place to ensure that we have more consistent funding?
I think one of the problems, I was out last week with our app team, and there's a person sleeping rough who had multiple health needs. I think the problem is that in an ideal world you would find some of the funding to support that person once they're in accommodation through a different funding route within the local authority, or through a clinical commissioning funding stream, because you're addressing a health need. So it would be social care, CCG funding, being locked in to somebody getting into accommodation. That would be the dream. That doesn't happen. So I think quite often rough sleeping remains seen as a housing issue, when, as we all know, it's clearly much greater than that. And I think that's what we've got to really battle on, really, around. And I think that if the Care Act does do what it is supposed to do, which is to assess vulnerability in a different way, the long-term objective should be to make sure that group of rough sleepers with that high level of need get support from a different funding support from a different part of the system, through the local authority, through social care, or through health. That's the great challenge. So my case is, let's not have funding siloed as it is. And the other thing I would throw in also, personally, as an organisation, this is very much a provider view, I like the payment by results approach, and I thought the social impact bond for rough sleepers that was commissioned by the GLA, and another one's going to be commissioned, is particularly innovative because it allows the provider to think of new ways of doing things without restrictions, or without the same kind of restrictions, because essentially you're being judged on outcomes. and you have to find new ways. So I think it's not so much the length of funding that I would talk up, but it's actually the flexibility to do things differently, because I would say the challenge of long-term funding from the Commissioner's point of view is how do you keep an organisation on its toes, and how do you keep them doing things which are innovative. So if you have 5 years funding, fine, but how do you keep changing as you need to respond to new needs?
Interesting. How many people get, I mean, Kath, do you get social impact bonds? I mean, are you using social impact bonds?
So we're not within the local authority, but the voluntary sector had been commissioned by the GLA and had got that money through the social impact bond. So that they had a defined cohort of rough sleepers, some of whom were in Tower Hamlets, some were in other boroughs, and so we had the benefit of that. And again, we'd have monitoring meetings, we'd look at how the outcomes were for each individual, as well as, overall, how the project was working. I sat on the project evaluation board, the project management board, and looked at how we can do that, how we can do it better, as good or better next time round. So, yeah, we're not getting it as a local authority, but we're getting the benefit of it.
It's an example of one of the needs for having different pots of funding for different things, because with the social impact bond, it was an identified cohort of clients that had been through other commissioned services or were still in contact with other commissioned services, but one glove doesn't fit all people, so it was adding additional support. And like Jeremy said, I guess the beauty of it was for an outreach worker not to have any other measures other than the outcome. So we had workers who could just spend the whole day, for days on end, on a bench with one individual who's never engaged with any services, and they're only being judged on the outcome, and they can invest in that person in terms of time or finance to get an outcome for them, because you're going to get a payment for it at the end of it. You have to sort of think with a business head and a social heart, and it works really well from that respect. But it's not necessarily an approach that works for everybody.
Yeah.
But I think for particular cohorts of clients.
Specific cases. Assembly Member Cooper, you did indicate earlier, did you want to come in on this?
Yes, and at the risk of poaching onto one of our subsequent questions, but in terms of the funding, I've forgot to disclose that I have worked in supported housing myself in the past, and including running hostels for people who are coming straight off the street, and including wet hostels, which is quite an exciting field to work in. I can see Jeremy's smiling at that. But one of the issues for me is about the increase in people with alcohol problems. And I have a specific facility in my constituency, but have spoken to others in the sector. And it would seem that there is not just some issues about how we put the money together and breaking down the silos, but also the length of the funding. So in particular, if you are going to work successfully with someone, perhaps to support them through moving away from alcohol dependence, funding them for 3 months may not end up with a successful outcome. And it seems to me that that is one of the issues that needs to be tackled, is making sure that someone has the support for the length of time that's going to enable them to move on from that. They might start in a wet hostel and then end up somewhere completely different, and then supporting them through AA and 12 steps and all the rest of it. But 3 months, that just seems very short, and that seems to be the new normal. I mean, is that something you're all familiar with and able to challenge?
Issues with support housing projects and hostel projects, they may be commissioned for longer periods of time, so 2 to 3 years at a time. But then the services around those that complement the work that clients access may change and differ. So we feel that with No Second Night Out, for example, that we're lucky to have 2-3 years at a time commissioning with that. But then the initiatives that crop up that really support it, whether it's mental health input or to do with drug and alcohol support or staging post accommodation for short-term measures, they come and go, and the funding around those initiatives is sort of short-term. And I think Jeremy made the point earlier about how do we look at kind of joint commissioning services and more strategically putting some of that funding together so they complement each other.
You can target an outcome, but if you're not going to achieve it and you're just going to have someone coming back in, that doesn't seem like a sensible approach.
Yeah, and I quite agree with you. I think a personal package of support around a person with a drink problem, again, would be the dream. And you're picking out, for me, probably the main cohort on the street that we need to do better with. 48% of rough sleepers have got an alcohol problem. We're probably pretty good at containing them in the UK in terms of them moving into hostels and being supported, including people coming into hostels who are carrying on drinking, which in North America is still regarded as being quite unusual. We're good at that. We're not helping enough in terms of helping people change their behaviour and change, and actually in the end stop drinking altogether. So yes, the dream would be that you have a package of support around the individual that would include access to detox and the counselling that the people need to deal with their alcohol problem long term. But I would also say, when I look at people who have made the big step away from drinking and stopping altogether and transforming their lives completely, it's often been around getting into work. So I've got 60 colleagues who are former homeless people, and some of them were the most severe, extreme street drinkers at one stage. And that's what they would say. Ultimately, once you've got to the point where you're working and you're seen as a valued member of the workforce, that's when you really are kissing goodbye homelessness. You can rip the label off and move on with your life.
I'm just concerned that the package of assisting someone to that point when they're ready to go into the employment is now being very squeezed because either health or local authority funding is being abbreviated, so they're never getting to that point.
Yeah.
Can I just ask on the employment thing, are there still 4A schemes?
There are. Yeah.
There are. Are they being reduced?
I don't know. I mean, they're very focused around younger people, of course. So
Yeah.
we're talking
Really
here.
important, taking
Yeah.
people, helping them into employment.
Enormously important. There's a lot you can do without it being linked to accommodation, of course. So there's many services, indeed services that have been commissioned by central government and local authorities to get people back into work. So I would just emphasise how sometimes what we do around employment is to deal with that too long down the line. Our experience, and I suspect Amanda's experience with the social impact bond for rough sleepers, was that when it comes to employment, even when people are moving off the street, if you can create some momentum of change started by somebody coming off the street and move very, very briskly on to helping people look at increasing their skills, you can get some really good outcomes very quickly. And that was one of the learnings for us around the social impact bond for rough sleepers. We underestimated how successful we could be helping people to get skilled up. And we, in some areas, we overestimated what we could achieve. On that one, we underestimated, which was a lesson for us.
Sounds as though we need more information about social impact bonds because they sound quite interesting.
Can I just ask, is the social impact bond geared towards the entrenched rough sleepers?
So the last one was around 831 of the most entrenched.
And then we're looking at a new one which will be focused on 230 to 250 of the most entrenched. So the previous one was just above the most entrenched, so to speak. The 830 wasn't focused on the RS205, which who are the most entrenched. Whereas this one we're looking at being focused very much on the most entrenched. As Jeremy said, we've learned from the previous social impact bond and around those targets, looking at having more targets in relation to substance misuse. So we're looking at having targets in relation to individuals entering structured treatment, but that just being detox and residential rehab and structured day programs, as opposed to being on a script, because we know a number of individuals who are on the streets are on scripts, but actually that isn't actually helping them exit and move away from substance misuse. So we're looking at learning from what we've learned from the previous SIB to actually include in this one, focus on the most entrenched. As Jeremy said, it was interesting in terms of around employment of the previous social impact bond.
It's an easier thing to define, isn't it? A long-term, somebody who's long-term entrenched, rough sleeping, than it is. So you can draw up a contract, presumably easy enough on that. It's a bit more difficult for anything related to no first night out, presumably.
Yeah.
Potentially, and because
potentially anyone could be.
Yes, if you know this, because you've got a defined cohort, so you've got a defined cohort and you can define your outcomes based on that cohort, it's easier to have the targets. And equally, as Jeremy said, I think both, and I think Dan will probably echo, the providers like to have that innovation. From our side, we're very much, this is a purely outcome-focused contract. So we would just say, this is the outcome, this is what we're anticipating, and this is what we will pay for each outcome, which is what we did in the previous social impact bond, and then leave it to the provider to come up with, and therefore their individual workers to work out actually what would be the solution for this individual away from homelessness, which can work for the very entrenched because actually it is resource intensive.
Yeah.
What it can't work for is a wider group where you're saying actually you're just going to do a social impact bond for everyone. It would not be a good way forward.
Okay. Andrew, one of my questions is about how and what really does the GLA fund, and I think we could ask for that, couldn't we, to be written, sent to us. We've got quite a lot in the briefing, we've heard quite a lot. But in terms of the GLA's role, in terms of coordinating, there's so many different charities, there's so many different stakeholders, there's so many, the different authorities and so on, local authorities, that are involved in this field. How does it get coordinated, and how do we avoid duplication?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear in terms of what we fund, and that's not a problem. We can easily provide you with all the information in terms of what we commission and fund in terms of from the GLA. I think you're right, it is a difficult picture in terms of what other services are out there. I think we work really well with local authorities. We know what local authorities commission. If you know, we try and work hand in glove, and I meet, as well as the local authority leads meeting, I meet with local authority colleagues most days, most weeks, in terms of to work at actually how are we going to make sure that what we're funding isn't interfering with what they're looking at funding. So when we were looking at the DCLG bids in terms of what we're putting in, we worked and met with all the local authorities and all the providers to go, actually, where are the gaps? What should we actually be looking at putting in for the funds? What are we trying to do? I think there's a wider piece of work in terms of around non-commissioned providers, which happens, I think, from borough levels, and equally potentially can happen a little bit more from the GLA, to work out actually what gaps are they filling, how can we make sure that we're all working in the same way. And it is very difficult in terms of round soup runs, it is very difficult in terms of around those services where individuals volunteer to work with individuals directly on the streets. Actually, the impact they're having is sometimes negative on those individuals they're trying to help. But I think that is a more long-term and difficult piece of work for us to do.
Do you think then the GLA does do the role of coordination effectively?
I think we do as much as we can around coordinating it. Central government have a very key role to play in terms of around the funding for services, if you know, and funding for boroughs. Yes, we have the funding for our services. We don't control any of the funding that goes to boroughs. If you know, it's more we work in partnership with the boroughs and work in partnership with government to try and help in terms of around that. But we try and coordinate as much as we can, but we obviously don't have any levers or anything to do so. If, for instance, a borough was to decide to use their homelessness prevention grant on something different other than homelessness, we don't have any powers to intervene at that stage. That would be for DCLG.
I wanted to ask about that because a few years ago I noticed that the supporting, I'll come on to everyone else, I noticed that the supporting people's allowance, which is not ring-fenced for boroughs, was being cut by government, sort of top-sliced. But it was being used in a very uneven way by boroughs. I mean, it's there for vulnerable people, and the choice of who to help was very much left to boroughs. And from what I could see, rough sleepers were getting a very rough deal, actually. And lots of hostels were closed, particularly actually in Westminster, but at that point, Tony. But I just wonder, you know, what is the GLA doing about that?
So
Because
in terms of,
clearly that must have left gaps. And
I think we will always get involved in terms of when there are changes in relation to hostels and changes in relation to that. And I used to work in Westminster before I worked here. One of the first pieces of work I did when I first started here was writing to Westminster around the closure of hostels to go, actually, why is this piece of work happening? What's going on? What were the void levels that you had in the hostel? Was that the reason why the hostel is being closed? And so I think we do try and get involved where we can around those potential closures. And in that instance, in terms of that hostel closure, they had such a high number of voids for such a long length of time that despite there being the perceived needs on the streets, actually those individuals, you couldn't link them up with the hostel provision. So actually, you could understand the argument from Westminster's side that they were looking at decommissioning that particular hostel. I think we do keep our eye on hostel beds across the board, if you know what I mean, and provision across the board, but I think you've got to look at potentially different models. And so obviously there has been the growth in terms of around housing first and having people directly from the streets, and actually that sometimes being actually a good way of working with a very small number of people who might actually be ready for putting the services around them rather than a hostel environment. So I think we have to work with partners as much as we can.
mm-hmm. Is there anyone else want to come in on this?
In terms of, I suppose, the kind of linking the coordination and the needs around supported housing and supported accommodation, there is also an expectation on some of the providers that deliver the GLA contracts to do some of that coordination work. So Kath mentioned earlier some of the sub-regional groups, and Jerry mentioned meeting with local, on a very local level with boroughs. Through No Second Out and Chain, we produce huge amounts of data and produce quarterly reports for each sub-region of London, which highlight and shine lights on where the gaps are in provision or what the issues are for those different areas. And one of those areas is around supported accommodation, because there is a mismatch of supported accommodation and hostel accommodation in London. So it's very much a postcode lottery for someone who's rough sleeping, where they rough sleep compared to what the provision is, and we use that data to bring to local authorities and say, look, this is the issue in your borough. We've got X amount of people who've been waiting for supported accommodation for this length of time in your area, and try and encourage them to come up with a response to it. People aren't going to commission a service overnight, but we're producing the evidence and shining light on some of those issues.
I think Dave's being perhaps unusually modest. I think in my view, working with GLA colleagues, particularly Dave and Jonathan Qureshi, they certainly know the voluntary sector well. They can be challenging, but they're very knowledgeable. And I'm hard-bitten. I deal with an awful lot of commissioners and stakeholders, and that's a very, very important relationship in terms of both caring about the issue and knowing the issue in depth. I think, obviously, in terms of the regional-local balance, we have to be aware of that, and there needs to be very significant local authority, direction and powers, and indeed there are. The other thing I would say also, I think the relationship that has been created with central government has been very, very impressive, not least seen in terms of the amount of money that has come out of the Homelessness Prevention funding round for London. And I think that reflects the relationship. I'll take my £10 later. I think that reflects the relationship that GLA colleagues have with central government civil servants, which again is an interesting balance of being supportive and challenging. So, for me, I think that the coordination is very significant and very effective for London.
So in a sense you're saying that the different spheres of government really are working pretty well together. I mean, you've been very eloquent, all of you, about the way it works now you're saying the relationship of regional with national and then regional with local and local with all the stakeholders. So, but you also have pointed out that the silos, so there could be much more co-working across different funding streams.
I think there's an opportunity for more co-commissioning. I think that's something that certainly doesn't take place as much as we would like to. And for instance, with the previous social impact bond, one of the outcome areas we had was around health and A&E admissions. And unfortunately, due to issues in relation to data protection, we weren't able to get that data from health to go how many of those individuals reduced their A&E admissions, which therefore can give you the evidence to then go to health with some concrete evidence, say this will save you money if you're looking at joint commissioning. And I think that's where we've got to get better. That's the area where we've got to be able to make our case. And we're looking at it around mental health needs. So we know that the mental health support needs of those in the streets, as Jeremy said earlier, it's 46% of those individuals who've got mental health support needs. But in terms of how those mental health support needs are defined, they're currently defined high, medium and low based on the outreach worker's assessment of that individual at that stage, which isn't then, from a health perspective, something that they can then carry across and go, right, actually, what does that mean from our definition? So we need to get more effective at working at what our definitions are around mental health, so we can say, actually, it is X amount that have got severe and enduring mental health needs, X amount have got personality disorder, and then you can look at what services you need to put pressure on health to commission to help provide the services for those.
I'd be grateful if we can move to the next question, and then perhaps if there's anything left at the end we can sweep up. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. The No Second Night Out seems to have been reasonably successful, although perhaps not meeting the 80% target. But we've touched several times on the fact that we've noticed that there are a lot of people who've had interventions with them and then coming back onto the street. So an element of that sort of revolving door. Why do you think we are seeing that increase of people who are coming back onto the street? And I'll start with you, Dan, but happy to take other contributions.
Well, I suppose first of all, there are people. There is an increasing number of people coming onto the street, but still the number of people that do come back onto the streets, having been through No Second Out, each quarter is around 10% of the people that come through No Second Out. So it is successful, but I think the increase is that the options beyond No Second Out support are relatively poor. So I mentioned earlier there's a postcode lottery for some people in terms of supported accommodation, and even where there is supported accommodation options for people, often we have people that have burnt their bridges in different areas, or the one or two providers in that area won't have them, or there's not an appropriate scheme, or just the waiting time for that project is incredibly long for someone to access it. So they'll wait with us in a hub which isn't suitable for someone to be in for a long term. So we're often left in a position where if we're successful in persuading the local authority that the person's owed a duty, people are placed into TA with no support whatsoever, and we've had to distance ourselves from actually spending time travelling across London to support people with very practical matters, people with mental health issues who are signed off from the CMHT, who for not engaging, actually they need the outreach, they need someone to travel to the supported accommodation, to their TA. The support isn't there, so that's just TA for people who are owed duties, who are then falling out of that and then being treated as intentionally homeless by the local authority. So then
So you're saying that in some cases people are being placed a very long way away from, by local authorities as other people being put into.
If you've got a connection to Southwark, for example, the likelihood is you're not going to be put in TA in Southwark, you're going to be put in TA somewhere very cheap and probably on the outskirts or outside London, where your support networks aren't there. So if you're on a methadone script, or if you're linked into a community mental health service and you're moved somewhere far away, your chances of success are very poor, and that local authority's ability to access floating support for someone is patchy, because they may commission stuff in their own borough, and the borough they place someone may have no floating support, or they may not be entitled to access it. So just people going to TA are more likely to fall out, and we find in No Second Out we have to monitor, even though we're not going visiting people, we have to really monitor where people are at, and try and link them in with services in the area they've gone to, if there is any. Or make sure we're following up with the housing options team to make sure that if they make a non-priority decision for that person when they're investigating it, that they follow up with offering them some sort of credible option when TA ends, which often doesn't happen, so people then fall out. And then
is there a sort of postcode lottery? Is there a noticeable difference borough by borough? Do we need a different strategy for central London than for outer London, or is it just sort of very patchy?
There's a definite postcode lottery when it comes to supported accommodation.
Right.
There are some boroughs that have nothing, and there's some boroughs that have got a real good level of provision, and so that's really difficult. If you've got, if you take some of the out of London boroughs, you may have 5 people per quarter that come into No Second Out, then really need supported accommodation, but there isn't that supported accommodation in that borough. Is that enough people for that borough to warrant commissioning a large hostel? It's probably not, but they need to be able to think more creatively about how they access other types of supported accommodation, from working flexibly with colleagues in other boroughs who do have that provision, and looking at what they can do to kind of support each other in that respect.
Is that something that we think that the new way of working with the subgroups is going to be?
Well, no, it's one of the things in terms of the a new service that we're looking at, which is this hostels for clearinghouse idea, which came up, which basically we've got funding from DCLG to try and explore, which is looking at that mismatch, but then also looking at, we know that there are a number of hostel voids across London. On any given night, there's about 8% of hostel beds that are currently vacant, where boroughs are waiting for the right individual to come forward, or there's maintenance, there's various issues, but it's not being used as effectively as it possibly could.
8% voids is pretty high if it was in general needs accommodation.
Yes, exactly.
And even actually in hostel accommodation plus void, plus arrears, that's...
Yeah. It's a high number, so how can we use that more effectively? And that's what this project will look at, is actually how can you match up. So if there is, as Dan said, someone with high support needs in Waltham Forest, they haven't actually got the hostel available for them because they're not commissioning it. Could they access the one in Camden? But then what would be the swap that would go the other way? How can we work out a kind of currency that will work behind that? So we've got the funding from DCLG. We're looking at trying in this year scoping out how exactly it will work with boroughs. Getting boroughs on side of it. We had some early conversations before we put the bid in, obviously with boroughs, but now we need to go into more depth as to how exactly that would work to hopefully try and solve some of that mismatch of provision to individuals.
And you're recommissioning No Second Night Out from April, so is this the kind of thing that you would be looking to incorporate?
No, this would be a separate.
This would be completely separate strand of
completely
work.
Separate, because in terms of from our side, this came out through our consultation around the DCLG funding with boroughs and with providers, and obviously we were then already into the No Second Night Out commissioning process. The specs already out, that had already happened, so it's not going to be incorporated in No Second Night Out. We'll be looking at commissioning it out as and when it comes to that stage.
But you are doing that work with the boroughs to try and get that better coordination?
Yes, so we consulted with all the local authority leads before we put the bids in, but we're conscious that was their rough sleeping if you know, rough sleeping leads from the borough, and obviously we need to have wider conversations now with housing options, because we'd like to include supported housing. We'd like to potentially include for boroughs where they haven't got any provision for rough sleepers, that actually they could put in some of their local authority housing, for instance, as a swap potentially for a high needs hostel. But we need to get all those people on board, because we know that actually it's provision of the areas where they haven't got necessarily the demand that meets up them actually commissioning a service for them, where we actually want to get the support as much as your central London of boroughs where actually, yes, they've got hostels.
Other than supported accommodation, well, alongside that, we're having to place people into private rented accommodation, and the stock of private rented accommodation that's available to our client group is poor. It's really, really difficult to find somewhere that someone can afford that is, you know, habitable. And then we did some research a few years ago following up on people that have been through No Second Night Out, and even people that have been through and still in accommodation were often hanging on by the skin of their teeth in difficult to afford accommodation, or their landlord wants the property back. So even people who have low needs are likely to be struggling in that kind of accommodation.
And some very unscrupulous private sector landlords who, whilst they may not individually charge very high rents so they don't fall foul of LHA allowance level problems, may be massively overcrowding and putting in lots of single people. That we did a big investigation in around Wandsworth and found a company called Investing Solutions who were behaving in the most deplorable way and sort of warehousing people in really unsuitable circumstances, and then charging the local authority unbelievably large amounts of money by overcrowding people in, you know, basically slums.
Yeah, it's a really difficult situation to be in. We have to be very careful about where we place people, because we have our own checks and balances that we use to mitigate against that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So first stage hostel beds are increasing in London, but the number of people returning to the streets is increasing. So what's wrong? What goes wrong after people have received that first stage accommodation? What do we need to fix this?
They're not necessarily people that are falling out of that first stage accommodation, but I think the main point really about the first stage accommodation is the point you've already made there, that it's you're bound by where you've got a local connection to access it. So if you're rough sleeping in Westminster and you've got connection to Westminster, you're relatively lucky in terms of options. If you're rough sleeping in Hillingdon, Hounslow, Harrow, or Bromley, your options are little to none in terms of supported accommodation, because there isn't anything out there. So that's the biggest challenge, I suppose, in terms of access to first stage accommodation. It depends where your connection is.
Thank you very much.
I think
It's a big pardon. Sorry, Mr. Swain.
I think the hostel figures at the moment are very interesting, because looking at the stats, which I pore over, there's fewer people going into hostels at the moment than there were this time last year. And also, on paper, a figure that we can't be happy with, which is that around about a third of people in hostels leave for negative reasons. They abandon or they get evicted. So I think we have to address that, and it's very patchy across London. But the returner figure that's in the stats that I think you referred to, the 12%, that's people returning to the street after they've been off the street for a couple of years and sometimes longer. So that's a group that we need to be concerned about in a different way. They're not the ones that are churning around the system, which is something we experience a lot. They're coming back after a period of time away, which I think probably suggests that some of the support mechanisms we had in place through supporting people, that was mentioned earlier, may have been reduced. So the level of support we're giving to people in those long-term tenancies is not what we were able to offer in, say, 2005. So there's two different things going on here, if that's clear enough.
The other thing to add about supported accommodation is that actually not everyone that is in supported accommodation has a history of rough sleeping or bedded down contact. So we experience people through No Second Out that have fallen out of a supported pathway, got no history of rough sleeping, but actually they've been in that system for many, many years. And as Jeremy said, there's something to be said for the practice around how people are evicted from hostel accommodation, and how providers do that appropriately and don't just evict someone to the street, but look for other solutions for that person whilst they're doing that.
I think it's worth adding, obviously that's what the hostel subgroup has been potentially set up to look at, and it's something from the GLA's perspective, because we don't commission hostels, you know, we've never really properly looked at, so we're very keen to build on what's coming out for it and look at actually what should we be looking at, what is an effective hostel, what is effective in terms of around actually someone being evicted from a hostel, you need to have the, if you know what I mean, you need to have the carrot and sticks, so that needs to be there, but how do you do that most effectively, and what do you do? So I think that is something that obviously is very different.
Like a separate investigation itself, what makes a good hostel?
There is guidance out there and good practice around managing exclusions and evictions and abandonments from hostels, but how it's implemented by different providers is probably inconsistent.
I've been in some hostels where you feel like you want to wipe your feet on the way out, and they're dreadful places, absolutely dreadful. And then others are excellent. So there's got to be some kind of.
In terms of the scale, our hostels are relatively small as well. If you go to Lower East Side in New York, the Bellevue Hostel, 800 bed spaces. That's when you're seeing a kind of mass cramming together of people in a way which is entirely unacceptable. I would also say, under the social impact bond for rough sleepers, the organisations who are successful in getting that work, I think both of us were referring more often into settled accommodation rather than taking the hostel route, which was an interesting piece of an interesting experience, because we needed to get a payment for the long-term accommodation outcome. And suddenly the hostels seemed a poorer option because people were leaving too quickly.
Also, we know that some of those people, they've been in those hostels time and time again,
exactly.
and it doesn't necessarily work for them. And when that is the only option for someone, they're going to, if they take up the offer, will go in and fall out and go in and fall out. And actually, the good thing about the SIP was that you could offer them another option from the offset and wrap the support around them.
Thank you. We've got, assembly on this, because we've got about 5 minutes left.
It's quite a quick question.
Very quick.
It actually relates to the previous section. I didn't realise you were moving on so quickly.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask very quickly about StreetLink, which is the Pan-London phone referral service. Anecdotally, I do hear that people are not reached. So there's a bit of I tell people to use it. How is that a guarantee that somebody, the outreach team, are going to reach them, say, within 24 or 48 hours? How is that working? That's a GLA thing, isn't it?
It's commissioned by DTLG. We put in some funding to it, but it's a DTLG grant
Who
funding.
runs it?
So Mungos run the phone line, and Homeless Link run the app and the other side of it, and the database side.
Assembly member Bell, are you looking for stats on it, or?
No, I'm wondering who coordinates, who goes out. It's the outreach teams don't seem to necessarily get out there as quickly as you expect, and I want people to have confidence
on
in
the
it.
provision of that. So if we take a referral in, I don't know, Bexley, for example, it's reliant on, we'll take the referral and we'll pass the information on to the borough, or to, in that case, it'd be London Street Rescue, which is run by Thames Reach, and it depends on the shift availability. It depends on the outreach provision in that area. So some boroughs are really quick to respond and some aren't, and also it depends on the quality of the referral. So if you've got a member of the public who sees someone bedded down, by the time that referral reaches an outreach team, they may not be bedded down there in that place the next night, or at the same time, or at all. So it depends on a lot of factors in terms of the answer.
I think,
Like I said, do we have
I'm
statistics
yes. Can we
reports and
perhaps get
outcomes
some
from
stats on
borough
street
by borough,
lights?
maybe?
but,
That
but
would be
also very
useful.
quickly, it can't be like the fourth emergency service, because especially during the very cold weather, there's just so many referrals. And also people are referring people that of course we know, because they're very visible rough sleepers. So we have to be we have to discriminate in a sense. But when I was out last week, we had 2 fantastic referrals from caretakers of estates in Lewisham who had seen individual rough sleepers that we would never have spotted without those phone calls or emails being made. And that was incredibly valuable. So when it's picking up on the people sleeping up in more isolated areas, it's a great thing.
Yeah, that's what I would expect. I'm
It's
just
just
worried
that our
about
last
capacity.
question is a big subject, and
Sorry,
I just
I'm
don't.
going to defer to
so
Member
if
Copley
we
to
Maybe
can,
get some
I
statistics
thought you were.
to
I
look
thought
at.
you were. I thought you were asking
statistics
this one,
on
Tony. I'm happy to.
Oh, you ask it, go on.
Oh, go on.
Fine,
Well,
yeah.
okay, so yeah, this is obviously a major issue. The overall number of rough sleepers with mental health, drug and alcohol support needs is increasing. What's going wrong with preventative care work? Can I start with Jeremy?
Well, the number's always been high about mental health and substance misuse. And I think that if I was going to look at one solution that would really help us, it would be to have mental health specialists working more directly with outreach teams. It's a great model from Tower Hamlets, where we have a mental health specialists actually working in the team. So that would be one solution. And I think that although we're doing lots of good work around hospital discharge, different examples across London, indeed across the country, still much more we can do in terms of joined up work, not only about people being discharged from hospital and coming onto the street, but also sometimes about people going into hospital, and we can actually find a different route rather than that being the default. So a lot of work to be done. I'm not of the view that it's getting worse, but that doesn't mean very much. It's never been good. Those people on the street, it's appalling. There's probably 500 long-term rough sleepers with severe and enduring mental health issues who have been on the street for at least 2 years. Now, if ever we were going to get a national campaign around something that would really resonate with the public, it would be around that group, and I think that's what we should really push on. And we'd get central government support for that as well, I think, because it's a key group for which there's great sympathy, more sympathy than, say, Romanian rough sleepers, unfortunately, but that's the nature of it.
Would what you're talking about, I mean, would something like co-commissioning of services help? Co-commissioning of rough sleeping and mental health services, is that the kind of thing that you'd like to see?
Yeah. I mean, Thames does a lot of work in different London boroughs, working with people who are not homeless, who have got severe and enduring mental health issues. But there's so much similarity with the group that's on the street that there has to be a way of actually joining up, as you say, in terms of co-commissioning from health and local authorities.
Is that something? Because I mean, there are lots of sort of trials of I mean, we've got the tri-borough trial, and there's all sorts of different configurations, I think, of services around London, sort of pilot schemes. Perhaps a pilot scheme here, would that work, or is this something that needs to be done more on a pan-London?
It needs to be done more on a pan-London basis, because there are pockets of good work already. So Westminster's got a joint homelessness mental health team that goes out on the streets, which is able to do some of those assessments around severe and enduring. But I think it's having something that is pan-London. So because we know, especially with this group of individuals, they will move around, and if they're challenged, they're going to move around even more. So the trouble is, if you've got just a borough doing something good, then actually by challenging that individual, by trying to help that individual, their immediate response is probably to move away from that borough. So actually, we need something pan-London to try and actually help.
Is this something the mayor can start to try and coordinate now, or do we need to wait until potentially we get some devolution of health services as they're having in Manchester?
I think it's something that you can look at now as a pilot. So I think if you look at it potentially as a pilot, I think we can look at it now. It might be something that we need to actually do to then prove there is the evidence for then health to then come alongside to actually start looking at funding. So it's something that we have started some initial conversations with central government to see whether there is any funding that might be available for it.
Good. Any other comments on this? Dan, do you have any?
I'll probably echo what Jeremy and David said. That I mean, the challenge with this group. I mean, St Mungo's are running a campaign called Stop the Scandal, which is about the lack of mental health provision for people who are sleeping rough, and it's incredibly difficult. David mentioned earlier assessments that outreach teams do. Not all teams have the skill and knowledge to assess someone's mental health on the streets, let alone coordinate a response for someone in crisis. So a lot of the 200 people that Jeremy mentioned are in crisis and have been for years, and are largely not necessarily being ignored, but they're not. When you try to coordinate a response to someone's in crisis need to be assessed under the Mental Health Act, getting an AMP there and getting a mental health professional there, the police, and coordinate that on the streets is very, very difficult. And in terms of evidencing a need to get the health commissioning, we need to have some pilots run where you have more consistent approach with outreach teams to have mental health professionals on the streets that can do those assessments and say, actually, these are the needs, these are the diagnosis, and this is the scale of the problem, to be able to kind of generate the argument for more joint commissioning.
Could I just also add to that, is that we've been running for 5 years, having an AMP, a mental health practitioner embedded in the outreach service, and being able to meet people, assess, build the relationship, have Section 12 doctors come out, have people sectioned. A number of people fall below the threshold. They still need in-depth specialist mental health support, but they also have dual diagnosis. And the mental health service struggles and will reject people if they're drinking or have other drug issues, and that's what we need to address as well.
an 8-second question, Liam?
That was the issue I wanted to raise,
Okay.
was the, because if you talk to the police as well, some of those people with florid behavioural challenges, and it's not just about mental health, it's their dual diagnosis, and is there really enough coordination across both mental health and the drug and alcohol
Thank you.
area?
That's a statement, not a question. From me.
I wanted to raise, we're very short on time, but I wanted to raise sexual health as well, because I had a conversation with someone yesterday who went to an event where they were looking at homelessness and sexual health. Very, very difficult for people to access services, or unwillingness to access services until someone is housed. What can be done to improve access in terms of sexual health for people who are
In our
homeless?
day services. We have day services within many of the boroughs where there is a BV nurse, there is sexual health, there's well-being sessions, there's, and that's what needs to happen. It needs to be in the day services for those neighbours.
So in the greenhouse service in Hackney, you come in, you can get housing support, but it's often the case that the person doing the initial assessment realises it's really a health issue. There's a GP there that can do the sexual health assessment and other health-related investigations. And I think that's a great example of where you can get health and housing and the voluntary sector working in one place together very effectively.
That's fine. That's fine.
I'm sorry that I've had to cut short both members and guests in this session. It just goes to show what an important issue this is and how much the Assembly really does care about this issue, and indeed our guests care about this issue. It's one small point. I'd be very grateful if we can get from Tower Hamlets their official response to the housing reduction bill. That would be very helpful if you could send that on to us.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much to the guests for your contributions. It's been extraordinarily interesting. Can I ask members to note the report and the discussion?
Agreed.
And can I ask members to delegate authority to myself in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this discussion?
Agreed.
And I think there's going to be a lot of output as well. Thank you. You're welcome to stay. We've just got a couple of more items to deal with before the end of the meeting. On item 8 is the Housing Committee Work Programme. Could I ask the members to agree the updated work programme as set out in the report, and ask members to agree the scope and terms of reference for its investigation into hidden homelessness as outlined in the report, and agree to use its meeting on the 23rd of March for a discussion with invited guests as part of the hidden homelessness investigation.
Agreed.
I know that's quite a mouthful. The date of the next meeting is scheduled for the 23rd of March. There is no urgent business. Thank you very much for your attendance. Sorry, you didn't expect it, did you? 12:01.
That's all right.